He spent his last $3, but not on himself, but to free an Apache. John lived in a small town that was surrounded by hills and wide, open fields. The town itself was simple, quiet, and peaceful, but life there was not always easy. Most people struggled to make ends meet, and money was something everyone seemed to chase but never fully grasp. John was no different. He had grown up in this town, learning the value of hard work and the importance of helping others. His family had never been wealthy. In fact, they had very little, and John had learned early on that life often demanded sacrifice. Despite the difficulties he faced, John had a heart that was full of kindness. He was known in the town for always lending a helping hand, even when it meant he had to go without. If someone needed food, he shared what little he had. If someone needed help with work, he would be there, ready to sweat and labor alongside them. People admired him for his generosity, but some also wondered how he managed to survive on so little. One winter morning, the town was covered in frost, and the cold wind blew through the streets like a warning. John had woken up with the sun barely peeking over the hills, and he felt the sharp bite of hunger in his stomach. The previous night he had eaten a small piece of bread and a few sips of water, and that was all he had to last until his next meal. He checked his pockets, counting the coins he had left. $3. That was all that remained. $3 for food, firewood, or anything else that could keep him alive. But that morning, John heard something that changed everything. There were whispers in the town square about an Apache man who had been captured and imprisoned. The man had been accused of a crime, though the townspeople said it was not true. Some claimed he had been unfairly treated, while others shrugged and said it was none of their business. But John could not shrug it off. Something about the story grabbed his heart. He could not stop thinking about a man locked away from his home, away from freedom, and suffering for something he did not do. John had always believed that injustice anywhere was a problem for everyone. The thought of a human being suffering, unable to protect himself, filled him with a deep sadness. He wanted to do something, but he also knew how difficult it would be. The town had rules, the law had rules, and money often made the difference between freedom and imprisonment. And John had almost none of it. $3, barely enough for himself. Yet, even with so little, the idea of helping the man kept him awake all night. He started by asking around, quietly, hoping to learn more about the situation. "Why was he captured?" he asked the shopkeeper. "Why is no one helping him?" But most people avoided the topic, shifting their eyes or shaking their heads. Some were afraid, others were indifferent, but John could not ignore the truth staring him in the face. He knew that even if no one else helped, he could not just walk away. He had to try somehow. For days, he observed and listened. He learned that the Apache man had been caught during a dispute over land. There had been misunderstandings, false accusations, and a rush to judgment. The man had no family nearby, no money to fight the charges, and no one to speak for him. As John pieced together the story, his heart ached. He imagined the cold, dark cell where the man was held, the silence and loneliness, and the fear that must have filled him every day. Every night, John lay awake on his small, worn-out bed, thinking about the man. He thought about his own life, how little he had, and how fragile his own survival was. Yet, with every thought of hunger and cold, there was a stronger thought, the thought that he could do something to make a difference. He felt a strange mix of fear and hope. Fear because the odds were against him. Hope because he knew that even a small act of kindness could change someone's life. John's friends noticed his change. He was quieter, more thoughtful, and sometimes stared into the distance as if seeing something invisible. "What's on your mind?" they would ask, and John would just shake his head and smile faintly, not ready to share the weight of the mission he had taken upon himself. The more he thought, the more determined he became. He knew that freeing the Apache man would not be easy. It might even cost him everything he had. but he also knew that he could not live with himself if he did nothing. He remembered stories his father had told him when he was young, stories about courage, sacrifice, and doing what was right even when it was hard. John felt that these stories were calling him now. The lessons he had learned from his family, from life in this small town, and from the countless acts of kindness he had witnessed over the years came together in his mind. He realized that the $3 in his pocket were more than money. They were an opportunity. An opportunity to stand for what was right, to help someone in desperate need, and to show that even a single person could make a difference. Days turned into a week and John kept thinking and planning. He imagined the journey he would have to take, the people he would need to convince, and the obstacles he would face. Every scenario seemed difficult, almost impossible. But each night, he went to bed with a quiet determination. He knew that if he could free the Apache man, it would not just change that man's life. It would also change something in him. It would prove that courage and kindness could exist even in the harshest circumstances. John began to make small preparations. He saved every bit of food he could, walked instead of taking rides, and did small jobs for neighbors in exchange for coins or supplies. Every action he took, no matter how small, was with the goal of using those $3 to make the biggest impact possible. He talked to the town's elders, hoping for guidance, but most were cautious, warning him of the risks. Yet John listened politely but followed his own heart. He believed that some things, justice, freedom, and compassion, were more important than fear or comfort. Even as the cold winter deepened and life seemed more difficult, John's spirit did not weaken. He found warmth in his purpose, strength in his determination, and hope in the possibility that he could make a real difference. The story of the Apache man became a part of him, a mission that he carried quietly but proudly in his heart. He knew that the days ahead would test him in ways he could not imagine, but he also knew that this was a challenge he was willing to face. And so, John continued to live in his small town, seemingly like any other man, yet quietly preparing for a journey that would test his courage, his heart, and his very survival. The $3 in his pocket were not just coins. They were a symbol of his willingness to put others before himself. The Apache man, trapped far away, had no idea that someone, so small in the eyes of the world, was thinking about him, planning for him, and willing to risk everything to bring him freedom. In those quiet, cold mornings and long, lonely nights, John understood something powerful, that true strength was not in wealth, power, or status, but in the willingness to care for someone else when it would be easier to do nothing. That belief, that quiet flame of kindness in his heart, was what would guide him in the days to come, and it was what would make his story one that the town, and perhaps the world, would never forget. John spent the next few days quietly observing the town and gathering information about the Apache man. He had already made up his mind that he could not ignore the suffering of someone unjustly imprisoned, but knowing what to do was another matter. He had only $3 left, and yet he wanted to use that small amount to make the biggest difference possible. Every day he asked discreet questions, listening to whispers and carefully piecing together the story of the man behind the bars. From what John learned, the Apache man had been captured during a land dispute. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and false accusations had turned against him. The law, instead of protecting the innocent, had sided with those who had money and influence. The man had no family nearby to help him, no friends who could speak on his behalf, and no money to pay for legal assistance. He was trapped, and the more John thought about it, the heavier the burden on his heart became. John spent hours imagining the conditions in which the man lived. He pictured a cold, dark cell with barely enough light to see the walls. He imagined the loneliness and the fear that must have crept into the man's heart each night. Perhaps he was hungry. Perhaps he wondered if anyone cared. John could not stop thinking about the suffering that the man endured, and with each passing day, his determination to help grew stronger. The townspeople continued to talk, some in hushed tones, some openly, but few seemed willing to step forward to help. Some were afraid of the consequences of challenging the system, while others believed it was none of their concern. John listened carefully to these conversations, storing every detail in his mind. He knew he had to be careful. The path he was about to take was filled with uncertainty and risk. One wrong move could mean that not only would the Apache man remain imprisoned, but John himself could face trouble. Despite the risks, John felt that he had no choice. The more he learned about the man's situation, the more he realized that inaction was not an option. He could not return to his daily routine and pretend that everything was fine while someone else suffered. He began to talk quietly with a few people he trusted, hoping to find guidance. Some offered advice, while others warned him to give up. But John felt in his heart that he must continue. He had always believed that true courage was acting according to what is right, even when it is difficult, and this was one of those moments. John decided that he needed to understand the system better. He began visiting the offices where the prisoner had been held. He asked questions politely, trying to learn what it would take to secure the man's release. The officials were often dismissive, some even rude, but John did not lose hope. He knew that persistence was key. Day after day, he returned, sometimes being ignored, sometimes being redirected, and sometimes being mocked. Yet each time he left with a little more knowledge, a little more understanding of what needed to be done. During this process, John realized that money played a role. Bribes, fees, or payments were often demanded to speed up procedures or to persuade someone to act. It was a bitter truth, but it was one John could not ignore. He had only $3, barely enough for his own survival, yet he began thinking creatively. He wondered how he could make the most impact with the small amount he had. Could it be enough to convince someone to help? Could it pay for something essential that would bring the man closer to freedom? These questions kept him awake at night, but they also fueled his determination. As John continued his investigation, he learned more about the Apache man's life. He discovered that the man was known for his honesty, his bravery, and his gentle nature. Stories from the few who knew him spoke of his kindness, his respect for others, and his unwavering sense of justice. John felt a deep connection to the man he had never met. He admired the qualities he read about, and this admiration strengthened his resolve. He could not let such a man suffer because of lies and injustice. John also began to feel the weight of his own limitations. He was just one man with no wealth, no influence, and little power. The task ahead seemed overwhelming. There were rules, authorities, and systems that he had no control over. Yet, John believed that courage and kindness were stronger than any obstacle. He remembered the lessons from his childhood, the stories of people who had stood for what was right, even when the odds were against them. He knew that the Apache man's freedom depended on someone willing to act with bravery and compassion. That someone, John realized, had to be him. Even with this understanding, John had to plan carefully. He could not rush into the situation blindly. Every move needed to be thoughtful. He started making small preparations. He saved every coin he could, carefully calculated the resources he would need, and thought through possible obstacles. He imagined the journey to free the man, the people he would meet, and the challenges he might face along the way. Each scenario was difficult, but John felt that nothing was impossible if he stayed determined and focused. In the evenings, John often walked through the town quietly, reflecting on the journey ahead. He watched the families inside their warm homes, the children playing in the streets, and the lights twinkling in the windows. He knew that for some, life was comfortable and easy, but for the Apache man, life was filled with hardship and uncertainty. John felt a mixture of sadness and resolve. He understood that helping the man would not bring him immediate reward or recognition. It would be a selfless act, done purely out of compassion and a sense of justice. As he planned, John also considered the risks to himself. Helping the Apache man might bring trouble. Authorities could be suspicious. People might misunderstand his intentions. He could lose what little he had, and there was a chance he might even face danger. Yet, he was not afraid. He understood that fear was a natural part of doing what is right. Courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear but the decision to act despite it. Every night, he strengthened his resolve, reminding himself that the reward of saving a life was far greater than any personal risk. John's commitment grew stronger when he heard about the man's condition from a sympathetic guard. The guard described the prisoner as patient, respectful, but weary from the harsh conditions. The Apache man had endured the cold, hunger, and loneliness with quiet dignity. Hearing this only increased John's admiration and compassion. He knew that the man deserved freedom and justice. He also realized that time was of the essence. The longer the man remained in prison, the harder it would be to help him. With every passing day, John's plan became clearer. He knew that he had to act carefully, wisely, and bravely. He started thinking about how he could use his last $3 to make a meaningful difference. Could it be enough to pay for a key service, convince someone to help, or provide a crucial step in the man's release? John weighed every option, imagining the outcomes of each decision. He knew that even a small act, if placed carefully, could have a profound impact. In quiet moments, John reflected on his own life and struggles. He had lived through hardship, poverty, and hunger, but he had also learned the value of kindness, courage, and perseverance. He understood that life was not about what one had, but about what one could give. The $3 in his pocket represented more than money. They were a tool, a symbol, and a promise. A promise to the Apache man, to himself, and to the world that he would act with integrity and compassion. John's days were filled with planning, observation, and careful preparation. He remained humble, quiet, and unassuming, blending into the rhythm of the town while quietly carrying the weight of a mission that could change someone's life. His dedication was silent but powerful. Every action, every thought, every coin saved was a step toward freedom for a man he had never met but already admired deeply. As part 2 comes to an end, John stood at the edge of a decision that would test everything he had learned about courage, kindness, and sacrifice. He understood that the journey ahead would not be easy. There would be challenges, obstacles, and risks that could overwhelm him. Yet he also knew that his determination, his creativity, and his willingness to act selflessly could change the course of one man's life, and perhaps inspire others in ways he could not yet imagine. John had spent days learning about the situation, observing the town, and carefully planning his next steps. Now, the time had come to make a decision that would define not just the fate of the Apache man, but also the kind of person John wanted to be. The $3 in his pocket seemed both insignificant and priceless at the same time. It was all he had left in the world, and yet it could become a symbol of courage, selflessness, and hope. Every morning, John woke up with a sense of urgency. He thought about the man behind bars, alone in the cold cell, and the injustice he was enduring. At the same time, he thought about his own survival. $3 were barely enough to buy even a small meal for himself, and winter was harsh. Food, firewood, and basic necessities all required money. Yet as John stared at the coins, he realized something powerful. Survival without integrity, without action in the face of injustice, was not true living. Helping someone in need, even at great personal cost, was worth more than anything money could buy. John began weighing his options. He could keep the $3 and ensure his own safety and comfort for a little longer. That choice would allow him to eat, stay warm, and continue his life without immediate risk. but deep in his heart, he knew he could not do that. The thought of leaving the Apache man to suffer while he remained comfortable filled him with guilt. Each coin in his pocket seemed to call out to him, asking, "Will you use me for yourself, or will you use me to make a difference?" The more John thought about it, the more he realized that helping the man was the right choice. He remembered the stories his parents had told him about courage, selflessness, and doing what is right even when it is difficult. Those lessons had always been a part of him, shaping his thoughts, actions, and beliefs. Now they demanded action. It was one thing to admire courage from a distance. It was another to live it, to risk everything for the sake of justice and kindness. Night after night, John sat on his worn-out chair by the small window of his home, staring at the stars. He imagined the Apache man in his dark, cold cell. The man's face, calm yet weary, appeared in his mind again and again. John thought about the loneliness, the hunger, and the fear the man must have endured. The image tugged at his heart with such intensity that it became impossible to ignore. Each night, he reaffirmed his decision. He would spend his last $3 not on himself, but to free a stranger who deserved justice. The decision was not easy. Fear constantly whispered in John's mind. What if his effort failed? What if the money was wasted? What if he himself ended up in trouble? These thoughts were frightening, but John knew that fear was a natural part of doing something meaningful. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was acting despite it, and he was ready to act. Once the decision was made, John turned his attention to planning the next steps. He needed to use his $3 wisely. Every penny had to count. He visited the few people in town who might be sympathetic or helpful. He spoke quietly, carefully, asking questions without revealing too much. He explained that he wanted to help someone who had been treated unfairly, someone who deserved freedom. Some people were skeptical, some cautious, but a few offered advice on what could be done. John listened carefully, weighing every suggestion. As he learned more about the process, John realized that small acts could have a big impact. A little money could unlock doors, pay fees, or persuade someone with influence to act. Every detail mattered. He calculated every possible use of his $3, imagining the path that would lead to the man's release. Each option seemed risky, but he knew that calculated risks were part of any meaningful effort. He was determined to be thoughtful, precise, and courageous. The preparation was not just practical, it was emotional. John spent hours reflecting on his values, his intentions, and the kind of person he wanted to be. He understood that his decision would define him in ways he could not yet see. Would he be remembered as someone who looked away, or as someone who acted selflessly, even at great personal cost? The answer seemed clear. He wanted to be the person who chose kindness, courage, and justice over comfort, fear, and self-interest. John also prepared for the possible consequences. He knew that using his last money in this way could leave him hungry, cold, or struggling. Yet, the thought of helping the man made the sacrifice feel lighter. Every hardship he imagined seemed worth it if it could bring freedom to someone suffering unfairly. In a way, the act itself became more important than the outcome. He knew that true courage was measured not only by results, but also by the willingness to act in the first place. The more John reflected, the more he realized that his $3 were not just coins, they were a tool of change. They could become the means to alter a life, to restore dignity, and to bring hope to someone who had none. He felt a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. Every decision, every step, every small action he would take from now on was guided by this purpose. The Apache man's freedom was no longer just someone else's problem. It had become John's mission, his responsibility, and his moral obligation. The day finally arrived when John decided it was time to act. He gathered his courage, tucked the $3 safely in his pocket, and prepared to set the plan in motion. The town seemed quiet, almost as if it sensed the significance of the moment. Every step John took felt heavy with meaning. He knew that once he used the money, there would be no turning back. Yet, fear had been replaced by resolve, doubt had been replaced by clarity, and hesitation had been replaced by determination. John approached the person who could make a difference, the official who had influence over the prisoner's release. His heart pounded as he handed over the $3. It was a small amount, but John placed it on the table with hope, courage, and faith. He explained the situation briefly, appealing not just to rules and logic but to the humanity of the person in front of him. "This man has suffered injustice," John said quietly. "He deserves freedom. Please help him." For a long moment there was silence. The official looked at the coins, then at John, and then back at the coins. Perhaps he had seen many such attempts before, people pleading with little to offer. But something about John's calm determination, his sincerity, and the courage it took to act with so little struck him. Slowly, the official nodded and agreed to help, though John did not yet know the exact details of what would happen next. The first step had been taken. As John left, he felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief that he had acted, that he had used what little he had to make a difference. Anxiety because he knew the path ahead was not fully clear. Yet there was a quiet joy in his heart, a joy that came from doing what he knew was right. He had risked his comfort, his security, and his remaining resources, and in doing so, he had taken a stand for justice, compassion, and humanity. That evening, John sat alone in his small home, thinking about what had just happened. He reflected on the courage it took to act, on the selflessness of using his last $3 for someone else, and on the hope that his small action might lead to a greater good. The night was cold, the wind howled outside, and he felt the pangs of hunger, but his spirit was warm with purpose and determination. He had done what he believed was right, and that knowledge brought him peace. John also thought about the Apache man, imagining him hearing the news, imagining him finally stepping out of the cold, dark cell into freedom. The image filled John with quiet happiness, a happiness that no money, comfort, or material possession could ever give. He understood that some acts of kindness, some moments of courage are priceless. They are the moments that define a life, not just for the one who receives, but for the one who gives. As the night deepened, John felt a sense of calm determination. He had made the decision, acted on it, and taken the first step toward a life-changing outcome. He knew the journey was not over, that challenges remained, and that results were not guaranteed. But he also knew that he had done what was within his power, and that was enough. Courage, he realized, was not measured by the absence of difficulty, but by the willingness to face it with integrity and heart. And so, John waited. He waited with hope, with patience, and with the quiet knowledge that his small but powerful act might be the key to freeing a man who had suffered unjustly. Every moment was filled with anticipation, reflection, and a deep sense of moral satisfaction. He had spent his last $3 not on himself, but on something far greater, a chance at justice, freedom, and human dignity. John woke the next morning with a sense of purpose unlike anything he had felt before. The decision had been made, and the first step had been taken. His $3, though small, had been placed in the hands of someone who could help. Yet, John knew that this was only the beginning. The journey to free the Apache man would be filled with uncertainty, obstacles, and moments that would test his courage and patience. Every step he took now mattered, and he needed to remain calm, focused, and determined. He walked through the town slowly, thinking about the days that had brought him to this moment. The cold winter air bit at his face, but he barely noticed. His mind was occupied with the man in the prison cell, imagining him sitting alone, wondering if anyone cared, hoping that someone would come to his aid. The thought of the man's suffering filled John with both sorrow and resolve. He could not allow this injustice to continue. He had committed himself fully, and there was no turning back. John visited the offices and officials involved multiple times. He spoke politely, always with patience, explaining the situation when necessary and expressing his hope that justice would prevail. Some officials were hesitant, some dismissive, and others seemed unsure. But John remained calm and respectful. He had learned that persistence and sincerity often opened doors that force or anger could not. Day by day, he continued to push gently, never letting frustration take over, knowing that the smallest mistake could jeopardize the entire effort. At times, John felt exhausted. The cold, the walking, and the worry weighed heavily on him. Yet whenever he thought of the Apache man, sitting alone in the dark, the fatigue seemed to vanish. Every hardship he endured was worth it. He reminded himself that courage was not about comfort. It was about taking action even when the path was hard and uncertain. The $3 he had spent were not just coins. They were a symbol of hope, a tool that could unlock freedom, and a testament to his belief in justice. One day, as John waited outside the office, he overheard conversations about the progress being made. The officials were reviewing the prisoner's case, questioning the validity of the accusations, and examining evidence that had been overlooked. John's heart raced. Could this be the turning point? Could his small act really begin to change the course of the Apache man's life? He remained still, careful not to draw attention to himself, but inside, hope and excitement swelled. John also thought about the townspeople. Some had mocked his efforts, calling him foolish for risking so much for a stranger. Others had quietly admired his determination, but were too afraid to act themselves. John did not let the opinions of others sway him. He had learned long ago that doing what is right often requires standing alone. His focus was not on recognition, but on the simple, profound act of helping someone in need. Days passed, and John continued to follow the progress. Every update he received, no matter how small, filled him with renewed energy. The officials began to acknowledge the errors in the case, the lack of evidence, and the unfair treatment the man had received. John's heart leapt with each small victory. It became clear that his efforts, combined with patience and persistence, were starting to bear fruit. Freedom was no longer a distant dream. It was a real possibility. Despite the positive signs, John did not let himself become complacent. He continued to visit the offices, speak to those involved, and monitor the situation closely. He also spoke quietly to a few people who had influence and might help. He was careful, respectful, and thoughtful in every interaction. He understood that this was a delicate process and that one wrong move could undo everything. His attention to detail, combined with his sincerity and courage, became his greatest strength. One afternoon, John received news that the final steps were being prepared for the Apache man's release. The officials were arranging for the necessary documents, verifying the details, and planning the day when the man would finally step out of the prison. John could hardly believe it. Months of effort, planning, and sacrifice were finally leading to a tangible result. Yet he remained calm. He knew that patience was essential. He could not rush the process, and he could not let excitement cloud his judgment. Every action had to be measured, deliberate, and thoughtful. As the day of the man's release approached, John felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. He imagined the moment the door of the prison cell would open, the look on the man's face, and the freedom that awaited him. The thought of being a part of that moment filled John with a deep sense of purpose and pride. He had risked his last $3, his comfort and his peace of mind, but now he could see the reward, not for himself, but for someone whose life was about to change forever. Finally, the day arrived. John stood quietly outside the prison gates, watching as the officials carried out the final steps. He felt the weight of the moment pressing on his shoulders. Hours seemed to pass like minutes, and minutes seemed to stretch into eternity. And then finally, the cell door opened. The Apache man stepped out, free at last. John held his breath, watching as the man looked around, slowly realizing that he was no longer a prisoner. The expression on his face, a mixture of disbelief, relief, and gratitude, moved John deeply. The man approached the officials to thank them, but his eyes searched for the person who had cared enough to help him. When he saw John standing quietly at the edge of the crowd, he paused. Recognition, awe, and gratitude filled his expression. He approached John, extending a hand in silent thanks. Words were not necessary. The $3 John had spent, the courage he had shown, and the persistence he had demonstrated had made this moment possible. The Apache man's freedom was a living testament to the power of kindness, selflessness, and determination. John smiled, feeling a warmth that no winter cold could touch. He realized that this was not just about money or effort, it was about heart. It was about the decision to act when others would remain silent. It was about believing in justice, even when it seemed out of reach. And it was about understanding that even the smallest acts of courage could create profound change. The Apache man's freedom was not just his own victory. It was a shared triumph of human spirit, compassion, and morality. As the crowd began to disperse, the Apache man turned to John and spoke softly, "I don't know how to thank you. You risked so much for me. I will never forget this." John shook his head, smiling. "You don't have to thank me," he said simply. "I did what I could." That is enough. The words were humble, but they carried the weight of a lifetime of courage and integrity. After that day, John's story began to spread throughout the town. People who had once doubted him now admired his determination and bravery. Neighbors shared the tale of how a man with only $3 had managed to change another person's life forever. It became an example of what one individual could accomplish when driven by kindness, courage, and a sense of justice. Children listened in awe, learning that even small acts of courage could have tremendous impact. Adults reflected on their own choices, inspired to act more selflessly in their own lives. Yet John remained humble. He did not seek praise or recognition. He continued his daily life quietly, helping others, offering a hand where it was needed, and living according to the values that had guided him through this journey. The Apache man, now free, had returned to his home, carrying with him the story of John's courage. And though the man was far away, their lives were forever connected by a single, selfless act of kindness. John understood something important, that life's true value was measured not by wealth or comfort, but by the courage and compassion one showed to others. His $3, though small in amount, had created ripples that would last far longer than he could imagine. Freedom, justice, and kindness had triumphed over injustice, and the lessons of courage and selflessness would continue to inspire those who heard the story. As Part 4 concludes, John stood quietly, reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey had been challenging, exhausting, and filled with uncertainty, but it had also been filled with hope, purpose, and the knowledge that he had done the right thing. The Apache man was free, the injustice had been challenged, and John had proven to himself, and to the world, that even the smallest acts, when guided by a pure heart, could create extraordinary change. After the Apache man was freed, John felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment, unlike anything he had experienced before. The long months of planning, sacrifice, and quiet determination had finally led to a result he had dreamed of. The man was no longer trapped in the dark cell, no longer forced to endure hunger, cold, and loneliness. Freedom was his, and John knew that he had played a crucial role in making it possible. Yet, even as joy filled his heart, John remained humble. He had never acted for praise or recognition. His actions had been guided by compassion, courage, and the simple belief that doing what is right was always worth the effort. The Apache man returned to his home, far from the small town where John lived. He was greeted by friends and family who had long worried for his safety. Tears flowed freely as people embraced him, relieved to see that he was alive, safe, and free. But amid the celebration, the man spoke quietly about John, telling his family and neighbors about the small, kind man who had spent his last $3 to help him. He described John's courage, determination, and selflessness in ways that made people pause and reflect on the power of a single act of kindness. Back in the town, John returned to his modest home, walking through streets he had walked countless times before. Yet everything seemed different now. The air felt lighter, the sun seemed brighter, and even the cold winter wind felt less biting. John had done something extraordinary, not through wealth, influence, or power, but through courage, thoughtfulness, and a heart willing to act for the good of another. He realized that his life, which often felt small and limited, had meaning beyond measure. One small act had created ripples that extended far beyond what he could see. Word of John's deed began to spread through the town. At first, people were curious, then impressed, and finally inspired. Neighbors who had once doubted him or thought his actions foolish now spoke of his bravery and compassion. They began to reflect on their own lives, wondering how they could help others, make a difference, or stand for justice. John's story became a quiet lesson in courage, proof that even the smallest person, with the smallest resources, could accomplish extraordinary things when motivated by kindness and determination. Some people approached John to thank him or offer gifts in recognition of his actions. He smiled politely and declined, insisting that he had done what anyone should do if they could. "I did what I could," he said simply, "and that is enough." His humility only deepened the admiration others felt for him. He was not a man seeking glory. He was a man living according to the values he believed in. And in that quiet, steady way, John became a living example of integrity, courage, and selflessness for the entire community. In the days that followed, John reflected on the lessons he had learned through this journey. He realized that true bravery is not about facing danger alone on a battlefield or performing grand heroic deeds. It is often found in the quiet, everyday choices, deciding to act when it is easier to ignore, choosing kindness when it is easier to remain indifferent, and standing for justice even when no one else will. John's decision to spend his last $3 was a small gesture in one sense, but it held immeasurable value. It had changed a life, challenged injustice, and inspired a community. The Apache man himself continued to speak of John's kindness. He often wrote letters, sharing stories of his freedom and expressing gratitude that went far beyond words. He described how John's actions gave him hope, restored his faith in humanity, and reminded him that even in the darkest times, there are people willing to act with courage and compassion. For John, these letters were a treasure far greater than any wealth. They were proof that selflessness, no matter how small the gesture, can leave a lasting impact. John's own life continued in the town, humble and quiet, yet richer in experience, meaning, and purpose. He continued to help his neighbors, offering food, advice, and a kind word whenever he could. But now people looked at him differently. Children admired him as a role model, adults respected his courage, and the town collectively learned the value of empathy, sacrifice, and moral integrity. John's story became part of the town's identity, a tale told and retold to remind everyone that small acts of kindness could create extraordinary change. Through this experience, John also discovered something profound about himself. He realized that happiness and fulfillment do not come from wealth, possessions, or comfort alone. They come from knowing that one has acted with integrity, courage, and compassion. Spending his last $3 had left him materially poorer, but spiritually and emotionally, he was richer than ever. The warmth of knowing he had saved a life, the quiet pride of standing up for justice, and the joy of seeing another human being truly free, all of these were treasures that no money could ever buy. The town itself changed in subtle but powerful ways. Inspired by John, people began to act with more kindness toward each other. Neighbors offered help without being asked, families shared resources more freely, and children learned the value of empathy and courage through example. John's act, though small in financial terms, had created a ripple effect, touching lives far beyond the Apache man. It showed everyone that courage and kindness are contagious, and that even one person's actions can inspire an entire community. John also reflected on the idea of sacrifice. He had given up his last $3, faced uncertainty, and risked his own comfort, but he had gained something far more meaningful. He had learned that the value of life is measured not by what we accumulate for ourselves, but by what we give to others. Each coin he had spent had been transformed into hope, freedom, and the restoration of dignity. This realization stayed with him, shaping every decision he made thereafter. The Apache man's freedom was celebrated quietly but powerfully. People in the town told stories of the courage it took for one man to act when no one else would. They admired John's persistence, his careful planning, and his unwavering moral compass. Yet, John never took credit. He continued his life as he had before, humble and focused on the needs of others. The real reward, he understood, was not recognition. It was the knowledge that he had done the right thing and that his actions had changed someone's life forever. Even years later, people remembered the story. Children learned about John in schools, neighbors shared it in gatherings, and the tale of the man who spent his last $3 to free an Apache became a legend in its own right. But John remained unchanged by fame or recognition. He continued to live quietly, helping where he could, teaching through example, and embodying the principles of courage, selflessness, and integrity. The story of the Apache man's freedom was a reminder that heroism often lies in quiet, thoughtful, and selfless acts. John himself never forgot the moment he handed over those $3. He remembered the fear, the doubt, and the uncertainty he had felt. He remembered imagining the man in his dark cell, wondering if anyone cared. And he remembered the profound relief and joy when the Apache man stepped out into freedom. That moment stayed with him, a permanent reminder of what it means to act courageously and selflessly. It was a moment that defined his life, shaping the man he became and the legacy he left behind. Through this journey, John learned that one does not need wealth, power, or influence to make a difference. What one needs is a heart willing to act, a mind determined to plan, and courage that refuses to surrender to fear. With these qualities, even the smallest person can create ripples that change lives, inspire communities, and restore faith in humanity. John's $3 act was proof that courage and kindness can overcome injustice, one small step at a time. In the end, John understood the true meaning of life. It was not about accumulating wealth, avoiding discomfort, or seeking recognition. It was about standing up for what is right, acting when others remain silent, and helping those who cannot help themselves. By spending his last $3 to free the Apache man, John had lived these principles fully. He had transformed a small act into a legacy of courage, compassion, and hope that would continue to inspire generations. John's story became more than just a tale of a selfless act. It became a symbol of humanity at its best. It taught people that the most powerful changes often start with the simplest actions. It showed that one person, with determination, heart, and courage, could challenge injustice and make the world a better place. And it reminded everyone that sometimes, the greatest treasures are not measured in coins or possessions, but in the lives we touch, the hope we restore, and the love we share.